I was 19 when it happened, driving through the Arizona desert with my best friend, Matt. We had just finished a late-night meal at a quiet diner off the highway, the kind of place that never locked its doors. The desert stretched endlessly around us, black against the glow of the headlights. I remember feeling an odd unease, like something was waiting for us in the dark. The radio hummed softly, but we barely spoke. Warm desert air poured in through the windows, carrying the dry scent of sand and cactus. It was around 2 in the morning, a time when the desert feels more alive than dead. The longer we drove, the more I noticed how oppressive the silence around us seemed. That was when I saw him. A man on the shoulder of the road, standing so still he looked carved out of stone. His arm was raised, thumb out, the classic hitchhiker pose, but his face was strangely pale, reflecting the light in a way that made his features look almost absent. I tightened my grip on the steering wheel. Matt shifted in his seat and immediately told me not to stop. His voice was urgent, louder than he meant it to be. I wasn't planning to, but the man's positioning unsettled me. He was close enough to the lane that he could have stepped in front of us. My chest tightened as we rolled past him without slowing. For several moments, the silence in the car felt heavier than the night outside. I finally glanced at Matt, and he was staring straight ahead, jaw clenched, color drained from his face. He asked me if I had noticed the way the man's head tilted, like he was listening for something. That detail made my skin crawl. When we had driven a mile down the road, Matt suddenly twisted in his seat. "He's gone," he muttered, his voice low. I checked the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the man walking toward us, but the road was completely empty, swallowed in shadows. It was like he had vanished into the air itself. Neither of us spoke again until we pulled into my driveway. Even then, I could feel Matt's unease, like it was pressing against my own. He mumbled a quick goodbye and drove off toward his house a few blocks away. I stood in the quiet night, the image of that pale face burned into my memory. I tried to sleep, but the image wouldn't leave me. I kept picturing his blank expression, the stillness, the unnatural way he stood. Just when I began drifting off, my phone buzzed on the nightstand. It was a message from Matt. His words made me sit upright in bed instantly. "He's outside my window." I stared at Matt's message for what felt like minutes, my heart hammering. The room felt colder suddenly, though the air conditioner was off. I wanted to call him right away, but something in me hesitated. If he was serious, then hearing his voice might confirm the nightmare as real. Finally, I dialed. The phone rang twice before he picked up. His voice was shaky, whispering like he didn't want to be heard. "He's standing there, right by the glass," he said. I asked if he had called the cops, but he only repeated, "I don't think they can help." His words made me feel sick. I told him to stay on the line as I grabbed my keys. Driving over to his place was reckless, but I couldn't let him deal with it alone. The streets were silent, the kind of silence that magnifies every creak of the car. By the time I turned onto his block, I had convinced myself he'd admit it was a prank. When I pulled up, all the lights in his house were on. His bedroom was on the second floor, and I immediately looked up at his window. The curtains were drawn halfway, and for just a split second I thought I saw the same pale outline from the highway standing there. My chest locked up as I scrambled to his front door. Matt opened it before I could even knock, pulling me inside with trembling hands. His face was pale, and sweat clung to his forehead. He swore that the man had been watching him for nearly half an hour, unmoving, until the moment my car pulled up. We crept upstairs together, and the window was now completely empty. I wanted to believe that maybe Matt imagined it, that paranoia had gotten the best of him after what we saw. But then I noticed something strange on the glass. Near the bottom of the window pane were smudges, like faint fingerprints pressed into the surface. They were too high up to be his own. We sat in his room, both of us too scared to sleep. Every creak in the house made us flinch. Every shadow outside seemed to shift in our minds. At one point, I thought I heard footsteps on the gravel driveway, though I couldn't bring myself to look. Matt clutched his phone the whole time, his hands trembling. Hours crawled by until the sky finally began to lighten, the desert sun spilling over the rooftops. Only then did the weight in the room lift, though neither of us felt safe. We tried to laugh it off, convincing ourselves that exhaustion had twisted reality. But in the pit of my stomach, I knew this wasn't over. For the next few days, Matt and I tried to move on as if nothing had happened. We hung out, went to work, and pretended life was normal, but the memory lingered like a shadow we couldn't shake. Every time I passed a window at night, I caught myself glancing too long, searching for that pale face. I never saw it, but Matt swore he felt eyes on him. On the third night, he called me again, his voice tight and panicked. "He's back," he whispered, almost crying. I grabbed my keys without hesitation and sped toward his place, adrenaline making every mile blur together. The desert outside seemed darker than usual, as though the night was swallowing the road whole. I couldn't stop glancing at my mirrors. When I reached his house, it was different this time. The lights were off, and his driveway looked abandoned. I rang the doorbell again and again, but no one answered. Just as I pulled out my phone to call him, I noticed movement near the corner of the house, something pale shifting just out of view. I froze, my heart hammering, before stepping back toward my car. Suddenly, Matt's bedroom window lit up, the blinds still closed, but a figure clearly outlined against them. It wasn't Matt's height. It was taller, its shoulders sharp against the glow. I wanted to scream his name, but fear held my voice hostage. The blinds snapped shut, plunging the room into darkness again. I stumbled backward, fumbling for my keys, when my phone buzzed in my pocket. It was a text from Matt. "Don't come inside. He doesn't want you here." My blood ran cold as I stared at the glowing screen, wondering if those words had really come from him. I jumped into the car, slammed the doors locked, and started the engine. My hands were shaking so badly I almost dropped the keys. As I pulled away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. For the briefest second, I thought I saw that pale figure standing in the middle of the road behind me, watching as my taillights faded into the distance. I didn't sleep that night. When morning came, I drove back to Matt's house, but it was silent. No car in the driveway, no answer at the door, and his phone went straight to voicemail. No one seemed to know where he had gone, and eventually people just stopped asking. To this day, his room is still empty, curtains drawn shut. I still don't know what we saw on that Arizona highway, or who that pale man was. All I know is that after that night, nothing felt safe anymore. Sometimes, when I drive alone on desert roads, I catch myself scanning the shoulder for that same motionless figure, arm raised, waiting. If you enjoyed this story, be sure to like, share, and subscribe. I grew up hearing strange stories from my uncle, but there was one that always stood out. He told it in such a calm, matter-of-fact way that it was hard not to believe him. He claimed it happened one summer evening in Arkansas when he was driving home from work. The way he described it always left me uneasy, like he was holding back something darker. According to him, the sun was setting when he spotted a man walking along a quiet country road. The man had his thumb out, the classic sign of a hitchhiker. My uncle wasn't the type to pick up strangers, but for some reason that night, he felt almost compelled to stop. Something about the man seemed strangely familiar, though he couldn't place why. The hitchhiker climbed into the passenger seat with very little conversation. My uncle described him as clean-shaven, wearing a button-up shirt, and carrying nothing with him. He didn't look like the rough type you'd expect on the side of the road. In fact, my uncle swore the man looked oddly well-kept, almost like he had been expecting the ride. The drive was quiet, and the man gave off an unsettling calmness. My uncle asked him where he was headed, and the man simply replied, "Just a few miles down." His voice was soft, yet carried a weight that unsettled my uncle. The silence that followed felt heavier with every passing minute. He noticed the man wasn't staring out the window like most passengers would. Instead, his gaze remained fixed forward, as if he were waiting for something. My uncle tried to shrug it off, but he said it felt like the temperature in the car had dropped slightly. He kept glancing at the stranger, wondering why his presence felt so unnatural. Finally, the man pointed to a narrow dirt path branching off from the main road. "Here," he said, almost too quickly. My uncle slowed the car and stopped near the entrance of the path. The man opened the door without hesitation, stepping out with a strange smile that didn't reach his eyes. Before closing the door, the man leaned down and spoke directly to my uncle. His words were slow and clear. "See you at dinner." Then he stepped away from the car, and just like that, he was gone. My uncle swore he never saw him walk into the woods or continue down the path. He just vanished, as if he had never been there at all. When my uncle told me this part, he always paused as if reliving the unease. He admitted he sat frozen in his car for several minutes, trying to make sense of what had happened. The dirt road was silent, the air completely still, and there was no sign of the man anywhere. That was when my uncle realized he might have picked up something he shouldn't have. My uncle said the drive home that night was the longest of his life. Every few seconds he checked his rearview mirror, half expecting to see the hitchhiker sitting in the back seat. The road stretched endlessly through farmland and forest, and the air seemed unnaturally quiet. Even the sound of his tires on the asphalt felt too loud. When he finally reached his small house on the edge of town, he parked the car and sat in silence. The words "see you at dinner" kept replaying in his head, echoing in that same soft voice. He couldn't shake the feeling that the man hadn't just been speaking casually. It felt like a promise. He locked the car doors before heading inside, something he rarely did. That night, my uncle couldn't eat. He sat at the kitchen table with his dinner untouched, staring at the empty chair across from him. He told me it felt like he wasn't alone, as though someone else belonged at that table. The shadows in the room seemed longer, and every creak of the old house made his nerves spike. By 9 o'clock, he gave up on trying to relax and went to bed. He double-checked every door and window before heading upstairs. Lying there in the dark, he couldn't stop thinking about the man's expression, that strange smile that seemed too confident. Sleep didn't come easily, and when it finally did, it was restless. Somewhere in the middle of the night, my uncle woke up suddenly. He wasn't sure if a noise had stirred him, but the room felt different. The air was heavier, and the faint sound of the floor creaking downstairs reached his ears. He stayed completely still, listening, convinced that someone else was inside his home. Gathering enough courage, he slipped quietly out of bed and grabbed the small flashlight he kept on his nightstand. He opened his bedroom door slowly, the hinges groaning in protest. The hallway stretched out before him, dark and unfamiliar in the silence of the night. Every step he took felt like walking into something he wasn't ready to face. When he reached the bottom of the stairs, he shined his flashlight toward the kitchen. His stomach dropped. Sitting at the table was the hitchhiker, in the very chair across from where my uncle had left his dinner hours earlier. The man sat perfectly still, his eyes reflecting the dim light as though he had been waiting. My uncle froze, gripping the flashlight so tightly his knuckles turned white. The man didn't move, didn't speak, but that same smile was still there, fixed and unsettling. It was the exact same sight my uncle swore he would never forget for the rest of his life. That was when the reality of those words finally sank in. He really had come to dinner. My uncle said the moment his flashlight beam hit that man's face, something inside him froze. He wanted to speak, to yell, but his voice felt locked in his throat. The hitchhiker simply sat there, smiling in that strange way, as if my uncle was late to his own meal. The silence was unbearable, pressing against the walls like a living thing. Summoning what courage he could, my uncle whispered, "Who are you?" But the man didn't answer. Instead, he slowly raised a finger and pointed at the empty plate on the table. My uncle felt his knees weaken because he knew he hadn't left that plate there. It hadn't even been set before he went to bed. Someone had placed it. The realization hit him hard. The man wasn't just a passenger he had dropped off. He had followed him here, or worse, appeared without ever leaving. That idea made his stomach twist in knots. The kitchen light above flickered once, and when his eyes darted back to the chair, it was empty. The hitchhiker was gone. My uncle stood frozen, the flashlight trembling in his hand, trying to make sense of what just happened. He walked toward the table cautiously, only to see that the food he hadn't touched earlier was missing. The plate was wiped clean, as though someone had eaten every bite. His mind raced, torn between disbelief and horror. Shaking, he backed away and ran up the stairs 2 at a time, locking himself in his bedroom. He pressed his ear to the door, listening for footsteps, but there was nothing. The silence felt heavier now, suffocating in its stillness. He didn't sleep for the rest of the night, waiting for something else to happen. When morning came, sunlight spilled into the room, and for a moment, he allowed himself to believe it had all been some vivid nightmare. He carefully opened his door, heart pounding, and walked downstairs. But when he reached the kitchen, he stopped cold. The plate was back on the table, filled again as if someone had set it for another meal. That was the last time my uncle ever drove alone through that stretch of road in Arkansas. He swore he never saw the hitchhiker again, but he admitted that every dinner since then has felt uneasy. Sometimes he catches himself setting an extra place at the table, even when no one is visiting. He said it happens without realizing it, as though he's being guided. When he finished telling me the story, he leaned closer and said one thing that made my skin crawl. "If you ever pick up a hitchhiker on an empty road, make sure you don't invite them in," he whispered. His expression was deadly serious, because some guests never leave after dinner. I didn't know how to respond, but even now I think about that story every time I pass through Arkansas. It feels like one of those memories that doesn't even belong to me, but I carry it anyway. And sometimes, when I sit down at my own dinner table, I catch myself glancing at the chair across from me just to make sure it's empty. I was driving through Texas on a hot summer evening with the sky glowing in deep orange as the sun slowly began to sink. The air was heavy, dry, and smelled faintly of dust as it swept in through my half-open windows. I had been on the road for hours, determined to push through and reach the next small town before midnight. The stretch of highway seemed endless, with nothing but telephone poles and empty land on both sides. The solitude of those roads was almost comforting until I noticed a figure ahead on the shoulder. A man stood there, motionless, with his thumb extended as cars occasionally whizzed past him. Something about the way he stood caught my attention. He wasn't slouched or desperate like most hitchhikers I'd seen before. Instead, he looked strangely composed, dressed in dark jeans and a button-up shirt that seemed too neat for someone stranded. Normally, I would never stop for a stranger. Every warning I'd heard growing up told me it was a bad idea. But that evening, something about him made me hesitate and eventually ease my car onto the shoulder. He stepped forward quickly, his shoes crunching against gravel, and without much of a word, he slid into the passenger seat. The door shut softly, almost too quietly, and I felt an immediate tension in the air. The man sat stiffly, his hands resting in his lap, his posture unnaturally rigid. He didn't smile, didn't thank me, only stared straight out the windshield as though he had been waiting for this ride all day. His silence made the hum of my engine and the rush of wind feel louder, heavier, almost suffocating. I finally asked him where he was going, trying to fill the unsettling void between us. He turned his head slightly, his expression unreadable, and said, "As far as you're going." His voice was low and flat, carrying no sense of humor or friendliness. That vague response should have been reason enough to let him out, but the steady way he said it made me grip the wheel tighter instead. I nodded, pretending to be unbothered, and returned my focus to the road ahead. The miles ticked by slower than usual, each one dragging with unease. As the sun dipped fully below the horizon, the inside of my car dimmed with only the dashboard lights for comfort. The sky turned deep blue, stars barely beginning to shine through, while the fields on both sides became black silhouettes. My passenger hadn't shifted once, his stillness unnerving in a way that made my skin crawl. I thought about turning on the radio just to break the silence, but something about the atmosphere made me hesitate. It was then he finally spoke again, his voice smooth yet unsettling. "Do you believe in ghosts?" The question came so abruptly that my chest tightened, and I almost swerved before correcting the wheel. I turned to glance at him, half expecting some smirk or hint of a joke. Instead, his expression was serious, his gaze sharp and strangely intense in the faint glow of the dashboard. I swallowed and admitted that I wasn't sure. I told him I had heard stories, even seen things that made me wonder, but I never knew what to believe. He nodded slowly, as though my answer had been the exact one he anticipated. The way he kept watching me made it feel less like small talk and more like a test. My pulse quickened, and I shifted in my seat, wishing the silence would return. The road stretched empty ahead, no headlights behind us, no sign of civilization for miles. My knuckles whitened as I tightened my grip on the steering wheel, my thoughts spiraling with unease. I could feel his presence weighing down the space beside me, and the air felt heavy in my lungs. Finally, I worked up the nerve to glance at him again, needing to break the anxiety his silence had created. The seat was empty. My heart nearly stopped as my eyes darted across the space beside me. There was no one there. No movement, no sound, just the dark leather seat illuminated faintly by the dashboard. The car had not stopped, the door hadn't opened, yet somehow the man was gone. I felt my stomach drop as I struggled to comprehend what I was seeing, alone in the Texas night. For a long moment, I refused to believe what I was seeing. My passenger seat was completely empty, as if no one had been there at all. My hands shook on the steering wheel, and I kept darting my eyes back and forth, expecting him to reappear. I told myself maybe he had crouched down, maybe it was just the dim light playing tricks, but the truth pressed harder. I was alone again. I pulled the car over onto the shoulder, my tires crunching against gravel as my breath came shallow and uneven. I turned on the overhead light, scanning the seat, the floor, even the back seats in frantic disbelief. Nothing. The man had vanished without a sound, without the faintest movement to explain how. My chest tightened, a crawling fear working its way through my veins. I sat there frozen, staring at the empty seat that had been filled just moments before. The silence of the night pressed against the windows, broken only by the faint hum of the engine. A strange chill lingered in the car, even though the air outside was still hot from the day. The more I thought about it, the more impossible it seemed, and yet the evidence was undeniable. I tried to calm myself, reasoning with my thoughts. Maybe exhaustion was finally catching up to me after hours on the road. Maybe my mind had created a passenger that wasn't real, some strange hallucination. But the memory of him felt too solid. His voice, his posture, the question he asked. Those details wouldn't exist in my imagination so vividly. After a few minutes of trying to steady my breathing, I pulled back onto the road. The highway stretched into endless darkness, and every mile marker felt like it was taunting me. I gripped the wheel tightly, checking the mirrors repeatedly, terrified that I'd see him sitting there again. The emptiness of the road around me only made the weight of his absence worse. I caught myself glancing at the passenger seat every few seconds, unable to stop. Each time, I found it bare, but the pressure of someone's presence remained heavy in the car. It was like an invisible passenger still sat there watching silently, filling the air with something I couldn't explain. The thought of that question, "Do you believe in ghosts?" looped endlessly in my mind. The unease grew unbearable when I noticed something on the dashboard. Faint smudges, almost like the marks of fingertips, streaked across the glass near the passenger side. They hadn't been there earlier. My stomach twisted as I realized they seemed fresh, as if someone had just touched the windshield from inside. My pulse raced, and I leaned closer to make sure I wasn't imagining it. That's when I heard it, a whisper, soft, almost inaudible, carried in the air of the car. I froze completely, my ears straining to catch it. It wasn't words, not at first, just a hushed sound that seemed to move from the back seat toward my shoulder. Then it became clearer, a low murmur that sent every hair on my neck standing straight. I snapped my head around, scanning the back seat with wide eyes. Nothing. Just shadows cast by the dashboard lights and the faint outlines of my bags. But the whisper hadn't been imagined. I was certain of it. My skin prickled as I turned forward again, gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles ached. The feeling of being watched pressed against me heavier than ever. The thought of pulling over again crossed my mind, but the idea of being stranded on that empty highway was even worse. I pressed harder on the gas, desperate to reach the next town, desperate for lights, for people, for anything that wasn't this silence. But even as the miles passed, that presence lingered beside me, invisible yet suffocating, as though I had invited something into my car that wasn't ready to leave. The glow of distant lights finally appeared on the horizon, small clusters that hinted at a town ahead. Relief should have washed over me, but the feeling didn't come. The whisper I'd heard hadn't returned, yet its echo lingered in my mind, replaying like a memory I couldn't silence. I wanted to believe it was all in my head, but deep down, I knew better. When I reached the outskirts, I pulled into a gas station that looked barely alive, its neon sign flickering against the night sky. I parked beneath the buzzing lights, trying to steady my nerves before stepping out. The air was warm and heavy, but inside the car, that unnatural chill clung stubbornly to the seat beside me. It was like something had followed me all the way here. I left the engine running as I walked inside, glancing back at the car like I expected to see someone still sitting there. The clerk behind the counter gave me a tired nod as I bought a drink, but his eyes lingered on me a moment too long. I wondered if he noticed my pale face, my trembling hands, or maybe the unease that clung to me like a shadow. Inside the store, I lingered longer than I needed to, not wanting to get back in the car. But eventually, I forced myself out, gripping my drink like it might anchor me. The lot was empty, the silence broken only by the hum of my idling engine. As I reached for the door handle, I froze. There, faintly visible in the fogged glass of the passenger window, was a handprint. It was pressed against the inside, the outline smeared and distinct enough to see the shape of the fingers. My stomach twisted in dread. I knew I hadn't touched that window, and no one else had been inside. My knees felt weak as I slowly opened the door, bracing myself for something to be waiting in the seat. But it was empty, just like before. I sat down carefully, avoiding the handprint like it might burn me. The smell inside the car had changed somehow, carrying a faint, musty scent that reminded me of damp earth. I adjusted the mirror to distract myself, and for a fleeting second, I swore I saw someone in the back seat, just a shadowy outline, sitting motionless. When I whipped my head around, there was nothing there. I slammed the car into gear and sped away from the gas station. Every muscle in my body wound tight. The road stretched on, and though the town lights vanished behind me, the feeling of not being alone never left. Every glance in the mirror carried the fear I'd see him again, sitting calmly where no one should be. Hours later, when I finally pulled into my driveway, I told myself it was over. I killed the engine, sat in the silence, and dared to look at the passenger seat one last time. It was empty, just as it had been before, but the chill in the air and the lingering question made my heart pound harder than ever. As I opened the door to step out, I froze at the faint sound that drifted from behind me. It was a voice, low and steady, repeating the words I had tried so hard to forget. "Do you believe in ghosts?" My body locked in place, fear rooting me to the spot. I didn't dare turn around. Even now, I can't explain what happened on that drive through Texas. I don't know if it was real or if something found me on that empty highway and decided to stay, but I've never driven alone at night again, and I doubt I ever will. Some questions don't deserve an answer, and that one still haunts me.